So Karen and I have been working with NCRECE, and one of the pieces that we've done is a survey of 7 states. Okay, so Marcy talked about one. Now we're just a little bit bigger. And we have done this in conjunction with a couple of grad students from UNCG that we wanted to also recognize. And we're going to tell you a little bit about the study, and we do want to acknowledge our NCRECE colleagues because a lot of our work has been collaborative. And our purpose for this study was really to get a better feel for student teaching experiences. So Marcy kind of kicked us off with the bigger picture of what we are learning about coursework and practicum experiences. And for us, our focus was on student teaching experiences, or the culminating experience right before, or in most cases, right before they finish, and what it was that we were doing in 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions to get a better picture of that. So we did select 7 states, and we went about our sample selection first by thinking about some of the factors that might be associated with differences in how teacher education programs set up their student teaching experiences. So we looked for some states that were geographically diverse, some that had a QRIS and some that didn't, and differences in whether they had a pre-K program or not, and then the size of the pre-K. Now, we did do a faculty survey, much like what Marcy just described, and had all those same challenges of finding the right person, finding the institution, the program within the institution, and then the right person, and then did that person know what the early childhood program was like. So we did a Qualtrics survey where we had a link and we sent it to whoever was on record that we could find, because in a lot of states there was no list anywhere. We contacted state specialists, we contacted, different professional organizations within the state, and they just said, we don't know where they are. So that mapping that Marcy talked about, wow, we would have loved to have had that first. But we did go through quite a process to find the people and sent them a Qualtrics link with an online survey that they could respond to, or they could forward to someone who might know more than they do and ask them to do that. So our sample, as you can see, the states listed here were North Carolina, West Virginia, Oklahoma, Nevada, Kentucky, and Maine. We also surveyed Florida, so I'll just have an aside to say we're not including them today because if we thought these were complicated, Florida is way past complicated. They're in the process of their 2-year institutions starting to offer 4-year degrees, and they're rolling that out kind of what looked like to us sort of on a as the institution wants to basis, and it was really hard to figure out, are they 2-year, 4-year, both? What are they? So we set them aside, and for today we're reporting on these 6 states, and as you can see we had a total of 108 programs represented across the 6 states. 61 2-year institutions and 47 4-year institutions. Some states with lots and some states with just a few. So when the first question was, can we find the programs that actually do have a student teaching experience? And what we found is that most do, or they had something that they could identify as a capstone experience. They might not call it student teaching, but we defined it for them as something that students do in a classroom for a good number of weeks. We didn't say how many, but is kind of what you consider their capstone experience. And so in our 2-year institutions, we see that out of our 61 programs, 50 had something that they called a capstone or student teaching experience, and 11 did not. Whereas in the 4-year institutions, they had a much higher percentage. Almost all of them had something that they would identify as student teaching. And again, these are some licensed programs. A lot are in the 4-year, but not all of our programs were teacher licensure programs. So then we looked at, okay, what is the dosage of the student teaching experience that students are having And we can see here that for most of the programs who had something that they called a capstone experience, it was roughly a semester long, so 15 weeks in the 2-year and 14 weeks in the 4-year. But we did have a good bit of variety, particularly in the 2-year institutions. And so in some of the 2-year institutions, it was 10 weeks, but one went up to 32 weeks. So their experience incorporated 2 semesters worth of student teaching. Whereas in the 4 years, it varied from 8 to 17. So the number of weeks was roughly equivalent to a semester, in one case longer. But what was quite different between the 2 and 4 years was the intensity of the experience. And so when we asked them, how many hours per week is your capstone experience? In the 4-year institutions, it was much closer to a full-time 30 and above hours per week. But in the 2 years, it was closer to 10 hours a week. So we really are in the 2-year institutions talking about a part-time experience, knowing that a lot of 2-year institution students are working, so they may be getting other experiences, and the same may be true in the 4-year institutions because both have students that are already out in the field. But what they're requiring in terms of a supervised student teaching experience was really part-time in the 2-year and pretty much full-time in the 4-year. So we also asked, what methods are you using to supervise student teachers? How is it that you go about doing that? And we were interested to see, what are they relying on in terms of giving students the supervision that they would need while they are in the field? And if you can see, both 2-year and 4-year institutions, almost everybody said we do on-site visits. So we have somebody in our program who goes to the program, observes, meets with, supervises the student. 2-year institutions were also also used student journals, so students writing about things that they had done, which that wasn't quite as common in the 4-year, but they both also used a lot of cooperating teacher reports. So what we see here from this data is that programs are using multiple methods to gain information about what students are doing when they're in student teaching. Now, what was less common was using videotape. A few did, and one used live streaming to supervise.
Okay, and so as we've been talking about how complicated teaching is and looking at professional development, so is the supervision and feedback. And so in this survey, we had multiple questions around supervision and feedback. And one of the questions that we really wanted to understand from programs was whether or not they used a published tool in their supervision. So if they're going to go on-site into these classrooms, were they using a published tool to provide some sort of structure and feedback to the student teachers? And you can see from the table up here, the majority of programs are not using a published tool. So we have about 75% of the programs across 2- and 4-year institutions reporting that they're not using a published tool. Then when we look at the 2- and 4-year programs, those programs that report using a published tool, we actually have more of the 2-year programs using one of the published tools than the 4-year programs. So we have about over a quarter of the 2-year programs using a published tool, while the 4-year programs are not having that high of a reporting rate. Then we also asked the programs which tools were they using. As we might expect, the environmental rating scales were cited most frequently. Some programs were using the CLAS. Other tools that were mentioned were the ORS from the NICHD study, the TPOT, the Caregiver Interaction Scale, and a host of other kinds of scales, which also opens up this whole discussion of the appropriateness of some of these scales being used for supervision. And we also asked them by age range, for infants, for toddlers, for preschool age children, for kindergarten age children, which also then, as we look at some of the responses and the published tools or the measures they're using, opens the discussion for the ages that some programs are using these tools. Then thinking about the workforce and the workforce going out into states that would have a quality rating improvement system. Within our survey, we had 4 states that had a established QRS system, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Maine. And then we have 2 states that are in our current data, Nevada and West Virginia, that did not, at the time that we were sampling, have a established QRS. So thinking, were this programs in states that had a QRS, were those the programs that were reporting using a published tool? And in fact, they're not. Our data look very similar across programs that are in states with QRS as overall, that really the majority of the programs are not using published tools, and very few 4-year programs are, and if a tool is being used, it seems that more of the 2-year programs reported them. And it's not to say that programs aren't using different tools and different kinds of state tools. We have a host of responses from programs that we're still sifting through where they were getting some of their structure for their supervision and feedback to the student teachers. So another way we wanted to look at the feedback that students might be receiving, given that they're in the classroom, this is an experience-based opportunity for them, what kinds of feedback and what areas were they being provided during this experience? So the first ranking we asked programs to respond to was around teaching strategies or areas of teaching. And so there were 7 different areas that programs had to rank from 1 to 7, with 1 being the highest priority of the feedback they were providing to student teachers. And you can see if we look first across 2- and 4-year programs, the top 3, child development, adult-child interactions, and planning. They're in the top 3 for both 2- and 4-year institutions. And then looking at the bottom, routines and transitions and inclusion, not as high a priority around feedback. Also, behavior management, somewhat interestingly, came in more in the middle ranking of priority, as well as environmental setup. But really thinking about 4-year programs having a strong emphasis on this planning, child development, and adult-child interactions. 2-year programs ranking higher child development, adult-child interactions again, and then the planning. And then neither, if we look across programs, really paying much attention to these issues of inclusion and routines and transition. Another way we asked about feedback was we were very interested in thinking about, what are students getting back from supervisors as far as their teaching practices were in the content areas. And so we had 8 different categories, again, ranked 1 as the highest priority and 8 as the lowest priority across the 2- and 4-year programs. For 2- and 4-year programs, language activities and literacy activities ranked at the top, highest priorities to give students feedback around their learning activities and planning for student teachers. And then we see with the 4-year programs, then the third one is the social emotional for both of them. 4-year programs then had the math and science, whereas science falls much lower than for the 2-year programs. And so we look at social studies isn't getting much feedback across the kinds of programs. And so there are some differences, as in fact, if we look statistically, these are significant differences for these mean ratings across all the programs with the exception of the language. And so there's really different areas of emphasis for the 2- and 4-year programs when we're looking at the content areas in which students are receiving the feedback while they're in the classroom, while they're practicing their teaching. So thinking about these data that we've talked about today, really thinking about this role of higher education in the development of the workforce and thinking about the connection with some of the state efforts in quality improvement. Thinking that teachers are a component in quality improvement, but we have very little information to date about the exposure they might have to some of the quality measures that are being used in systems. Also, we have 2 different feeders, at least for the workforce, 2- and 4-year institutions, some similarities and some differences across these 2 institutes of higher education as far as requirements, intensity of week-long experience, how many weeks student teachers are in the classroom, and so really this dosage of teaching, supervision, and feedback. And then these results taken all together really give us pause to really consider, this idea of perhaps a consistent professional preparation program. Also the consideration of policy surrounding institutions of higher ed, really thinking of licensing, as Catherine mentioned, many of the 4-year programs had licenses, there are state requirements, and how all of these pieces fit together in higher ed to really prepare for the workforce as we move ahead.